Welcome to the show. This is Greg Conte. I'm here with William. The topic of our show is Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, one of the most notorious and evil people in all of world history. Or is he?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. We should add another one of his middle names in there, Ichigo.
Oh, yes.
Yes, so it denotes his origins as a mixed race individual.
Kalergi was an Austrian and half Austrian, half Japanese nobleman in the early 20th century. I guess he died in 1972. So he was flourishing from World War I, World War II, after World War II. And he is probably most famous for a quote from a book that he wrote in 1925 called Practical Idealism. And the quote is to the effect that the future Europe needs to have a African Eurasian mixed race underclass. The
specific term is Eurasian Negroid.
Yes, a Eurasian Negroid underclass and an overclass of cosmopolitan Mandarin type people. A lot of theories have been made. There's allegedly a conspiracy theory about this quote that this foreshadows the desire of the elites to bring in all kinds of Africans and Middle Easterners into Europe to race mix and destroy the white race.
Yeah, the current immigration problem that we see.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's one of those things where it's like you can call it a conspiracy theory, but this seems to be what's happening.
Right.
But on the other hand, that quote does, having read both you and I, having read a lot of Kalergi's stuff and a lot of stuff about Kalergi, this quote isn't really representative of what the guy thought and believed. Now, that's not to say that he's good.
Right.
We're going to explain all the ways that he isn't good and that he's super evil. But it's one of those things where my takeaway on Kalergi is that he's like accidentally evil. It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as they say.
And it's as I think we were, the concept of him being hijacked as a philosopher, I think, by the current elites or by the elites of the time. His ideas were obviously completely different than what was going on at any other time. Well, actually, no, we can renege on that. It's not actually that it's completely different because
he has a lot of similarities with people like Spengler or Madison Grant, even, or
right.
Lothrop Stoddard. A lot of these racialist thinkers, or Hitler.
Yeah,
he takes a lot of the same assumptions. He knows race is real. He knows Jews are smart. I mean, he's reasoning from a lot of the same positions that any National Socialist would reason from, but he's coming to very different conclusions. And
I would argue an idealist conclusion as compared to a realist conclusion.
Well, yeah. So, like, I guess the best way to say it is, succinctly, is that whereas Hitler or a National Socialist vision for future Europe is that there is one nation, the strongest nation, and from Hitler's point of view, that had to be Germany, would unite Europe and lead Europe. And from Kalergi's point of view, he didn't want to build from the ground up. He wanted to build across the elite. So he wanted to take all the elite from the different countries and then stitch them together, or have them bring their countries together into a European Union, which he is the father of.
Focusing around the triumvirate of England, France, Germany was his major point.
Right. It was questionable whether England was a part, but yeah. But
right. Well, his idea originally was that it had to be England, France, Germany, but then after the fact, that kind of changed.
Which makes sense because those are the three most powerful countries in Europe. So you would naturally stitch those three together.
England's ambitions obviously changed, as he said specifically. They were more focused on their empire as compared to a European empire.
True. One of the other models that Kalergi often talked about were Switzerland being a confederation of three different language groups: Austria-Hungary, his homeland, or his sort of homeland. Right. He did live the first couple of years of his life in Japan, but he really grew up in Austria-Hungary, and then the United States. He wanted to build a United States of Europe,
and he was quite critical of Russia, despite understanding that it was in a very strong position compared to the other empires. Yeah.
So the book we read on this was Hitler's Cosmopolitan Bastard by Martin Bond. The title is actually a quote from Hitler. I think it's from Mein Kampf.
It is, yeah.
Hitler mentions Kalergi and refers to him as that cosmopolitan bastard.
He's not really wrong, you know.
So Hitler had a sense of humor,
right? And I think the bastard part was probably in reference to his family history a bit. because there's a lot of fun that his dad Heinrich Coudenhove-Kalergi had.
Yeah, let's get into that in a second. I just wanted to say about the book, though. This book came out last year, and it's by far the best book about Kalergi that there is.
Agreed. As far as
and it's the first book in English too. There are Kalergi's books about his own life are all in German. I don't think any of them have been translated.
Not that I'm aware of.
I read last year and reviewed a little bit before this Kampf um Europa aus meinem Leben, which he wrote in 1949, I think. And then there's also some other books in German. There's one called Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, Ein Leben für Paneuropa by Walter Gehring, which it's okay, but this Martin Bond book in English is honestly much better. So for all of you English speakers and readers, you can finally get the whole story on Kalergi. And the advantage that the Bond book has over the Kalergi autobiographies and the other books in German about Kalergi is that, well, especially over the Kalergi autobiographies, is that it talks about his rivals and his problems. Kalergi, when he writes about himself, has this tendency to talk about it like it's a fantasy or a fairy tale, and everything just went so great. It was so fun. Everyone loved me.
I'm sure from his perspective in the cafes in Europe, it did seem like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, he just doesn't mention his problems. I mean, his biographies or his autobiographies are basically just propaganda.
Yeah, most of his literature is too,
But one other thing on his writing, you've noticed this as well, that his writing style is very good.
It is phenomenal. It is credit where credit's due. The man is extremely well put.
If you are a German student or a student of German language, you're like maybe third year or so in college, reading Kalergi's books, I mean, they're evil. Don't make sure to wash your brain out with some footage from Triumph of the Will afterwards.
A lot of salt, yeah.
But just from a purely linguistic, grammatical point of view, they are very well written, very easy to understand, even for a foreigner who's reading German.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's talk about Kalergi's background and his life. So
do you want me to start with the fun bit for?
Yeah, let's talk about his ancestry. So he was, the Kalergi name is Greek.
No, it's Polish.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. So and this is when the thing. So his mother that had the Kalergi name was Polish, and they might have come from a Greek.
No, the Kalergi I think is a Greek name. The name is.
Oh,
Greek.
Right. Yeah.
But Coudenhove is Dutch.
Yeah.
And then his mother's, and that's from his father's side. His mother's family was Japanese.
My apologies. I was thinking back to Heinrich. I think we were going back to his father, where his father got the name from it or whatever.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So
sorry.
Going back to his grandfather.
Yeah, far back then. So his grandfather was Franz Coudenhove, or Franz von Coudenhove, because he was obviously a noble at the time. And it was his father, Heinrich, so the son of Franz, that married a Polish princess who had the last name of Kalergi. And that's where the Coudenhove-Kalergi element comes from, where the Polish princess got her name. I'm assuming it's actually Greek, but that's how aristocracy was all throughout Europe, right? Everybody got different names from different places because they were all intermarrying between the aristocracy. So Kalergi's grandfather, Count, who's still a Count, Count Coudenhove. This gets complicated, so do forgive us. But he had been in service to the Habsburg dynasty, and his family had been in service to the Habsburg dynasty, apparently going back for 500 years, an unbroken lineage of service to the Habsburgs for 500 years. And so Franz was very much an old world style aristocrat in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that means that you weren't allowed to marry outside of the aristocracy. And so while his son, Heinrich, which was Richard's father, was in school, he met up with a nice French girl in art class, right?
Where one does.
Where one does, right? So he met up with a nice French girl, although she was of the lower orders, as they would put it, right? So she was not exactly of the higher classes. So as one does with French girls, right? There was some. I don't know how to put this in a very succinct or polite way.
How to not say this without sounding like an asshole.
Right. There's really no other way. So he had relations with her, I suppose, right? And she became pregnant. With that being said, it was obviously a banned it was banned. It was banned by Franz, Heinrich's father, because it just wasn't a proper matchup. And so the child, upon birth at the university, she stayed at the university over in Austria until she had the child, and the child was sent back to live with its grandparents of French descent back in I don't think it was Paris, but it was in Europe or in France somewhere. So whenever this happened, though, in order to prevent Heinrich from going and seeking out this French girl, because he was actually in love with her, right? Like, he fell in love with this French girl, again, as one does.
Okay.
So he wanted to pursue this French girl, and his father, Franz, said absolutely not, and then he did the normal aristocratic thing and quarantined him inside one of his castles, right?
Right, you imprison your child if
Right.
they're trying to have a relationship with somebody out who's inappropriate.
Right, and now, note at this time, Franz Coudenhove was 21 years old at the time, right? Richard's father was 21 years old, still considered at the time in the empire in the Habsburg Empire as a minor.
That's so reasonable.
Yeah, I know, I agree. It's
Like, you really are a minor until you're about 24.
right. You know, like, in my opinion, it'd be even further than that until the forebrain is completely developed. But still, it's the point is that he's 21 and he's a minor, so his dad has the right to quarantine him in a castle. And he did this, I believe it was in one of his holdings in Bohemia. And so what happened, though, is that the French girl, with one of her friends, tracked down this poor man in quarantine or whatever, and went to seek him out and say, you know, hey, I'm trying to find my long lost star-crossed lover, right?
Right.
And so,
you know, you're my baby daddy.
Right.
You got to pay.
Right. And he did have the money to pay. Obviously, he could have given away 1 month's wages and made this girl's life in France infinitely easier. Although that wasn't what she was after. She was after, obviously, the love of her life, because she's French, right? And so Heinrich, in his tower, right, he had a very nice rose garden underneath the window of his bedroom at this castle. And so when this girl went to with her friend to the castle, Franz Coudenhove he headed her off at the pass, right? And he went there before she was able to get to Heinrich, and he denied her entrance into the castle. He said, no, you cannot see Heinrich. This is forbidden. You know, you can't do this, right? This is totally forbidden. And so, to protest how forbidden this love affair was, both the French girl and her friend. This is the astonishing part to me, is the fact that her friend went through with this. This is the best act of friendship, I think, in the history of mankind. So both of them went beneath Heinrich's window where he could see, and they both shot themselves and died upon a rose bed.
Wow.
It's
the real Sorrows of Young Werther sort of situation.
It's very poetic, and the whole,
except backwards, because the girls are killing themselves.
Right, yeah. So it's a very serious act of emotion here, right? So both of the girls shot themselves to death and they lied upon a rose bed and died underneath the window of Heinrich. And so this traumatized the kid, obviously, right? Like, this was his baby mama, and had just shot herself with her friend underneath his window in a very poetic way. And Franz, his father, was totally unapologetic about any of this. He did not care whatsoever about how this went down. And and this became a scandal, obviously, within the aristocracy thing, because you just can't have girls shooting themselves on your estate, right? That just doesn't go over too well.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. Right,
it doesn't. So this. You know, the opening to this book is phenomenal, in my opinion. This is the start of it. But so, in order to kind of subdue this scandal, Franz writes a pseudo essay that was only supposed to be given towards the aristocracy. It was supposed to be a very limited published piece, and it explained how he justified this whole ordeal by saying that the lower orders were supposed to afford, specifically the women of the lower orders were supposed to afford sport to the aristocracy. That was his justification of it.
Right, which is preposterous. I mean, and I'm not even just saying that because we're like, I don't know,
socialists.
Because we're like liberal socialists or something.
Right.
It's like, no, it is preposterous from the point of view of aristocracy. You can't have that attitude, and if you do have that attitude, you better shut the fuck up about it.
Right, exactly. Let's keep that quarantined.
You can't treat no European, not no European, but most European aristocrats. The reason the European aristocracy worked for so long was because they didn't treat the lower orders like animals.
Right. That it was part of their folk. That was the whole point. Is that that's where the rustic aristocracy came from. But now this also, before, like, not to get off on a tangent, but this also goes into later works of Richard Coudenhove, specifically in Practical Idealism, where he discusses the difference between your urban and your rustic aristocracy, and then we can get into that in a bit later, though. But this formulates the basis for these types of thinking that Richard had about it, because considering from his grandfather's point of view, that his grandfather thought that the lower orders were playthings for the aristocracy.
So anyway, Heinrich, the father,
was traumatized from this.
Age 21, that happens.
Right.
And then he spends most of his life as the next 20 or so years, he was an ambassador.
Right. Well, so that's the thing. So
a diplomat.
The letter got out. So it was only meant for limited publication and only for a few eyes. But this publication about utilizing the lower orders got out, and it was made totally public by the Austrian press at the time, especially in Vienna. And so it spread like wildfire, and it was a total like scandal thing, right? It made the aristocracy look extremely bad. And this obviously was, again, this probably played into some of the detriment to the aristocracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire leading up into the First World War, and that's a different story, but that probably plays into that quite a bit, as far as the press and everything else like that. But so that scandal got even worse and out of control, and the only way that he could continue to, in a sense, help his son Heinrich, for Franz to help his son Heinrich get out of this scandal that had really been started by Franz himself, was to send his son off to finish school as close to the Russian border as possible and keep him out of Vienna. And then after he finished his diplomatic schooling, his law school, he sent him abroad. And he sent him to places like Argentina, to Turkey, to all sorts of places, anywhere but Vienna, right?
Well, I mean, the Austrian State Department.
Right, yeah. So he sent, but he had a good life. It's not that he sent them away to live in poverty or something, but he was, living as an ambassador in all these other foreign countries. But the reason why he was getting all these foreign ambassador positions is so that one of the most, one of the oldest serving families of the Habsburgs that was involved in this scandal, it wasn't front page news all the time in Vienna. So they had to get this guy out of Vienna and send him abroad, right? Because again, he had been serving the Habsburgs for 500 years. This is a thing that they have to do, and somebody so close to the monarchy couldn't have a scandal like this going on. So they had to send him abroad.
This guy, Heinrich, though, had a pattern of behavior here, where he was screwing people he wasn't supposed to be screwing.
Right.
First, it was these lower class French girls. Then he fathered Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi.
And this is during his stint at the embassy in Tokyo, when he was sent finally to the Empire of Japan, the Empire of the Rising Sun, as they put it. And so the thing is about Mitsu, or Mitsuko, as his mother's name was, Richard's mother's name was, she was the daughter of a merchant. She was also not aristocracy, despite what the rumors are. So the most people consider Richard's mother to be, or to have been, part of the Japanese aristocracy. That's not true, because the Japanese aristocracy had at the time a very strict in-group preference.
Confucian values,
right?
Which are correct.
Right,
merchants can't be part of the aristocracy,
and that's how it worked. And the thing is,
the Romans had the same attitude.
Right. This is a normal
like, what value are you providing?
You're just producing money, in a sense, or values and goods and whatever heck else, but you're not. It's about the genetic quality here. Not to say that Mitsuko was like dysgenic or something, but the thing is that she wasn't part of the aristocracy. And while he was there, it seemed that he was only there for barely a month before he got involved with Mitsuko. So I wouldn't necessarily call Heinrich a womanizer, but he was definitely he was one of the guys that would probably go to those stingy clubs that we see today, and very much enjoy himself.
Well, at least when he was younger, he strikes me as sort of a lovelorn beta sort of type. Maybe he outgrew it later, but I don't know. It doesn't really seem like it.
Right, yeah, considering that. And then not only did he, but this is the thing. So he got involved with Mitsuko. They had Richard and all that other stuff, but he actually married Mitsuko. That was the thing. So, and he did this because he was so far away from his father and everything else like that. He was so far away from Vienna that he could do honestly anything he wanted out in the embassy in Tokyo. So he did end up marrying Mitsuko, and then they had Richard, which is where Richard's middle name comes from, Ichigo. He was Japanese, and his mother wanted him to have at least some of his Japanese heritage in the name.
And he had several brothers and sisters, but the main two were he was the second of the siblings, and there was one elder brother and one brother immediately below him, who had interesting stories as well.
Right, but this kind of position in the ranking of his family though did absolve Richard of being I don't really want to use the word indentured, but sort of the case to the Habsburgs as much as his older brother would have been. Just based on the linealogy of how.
All right, because the eldest brother has to inherit the family estates
and everything else. Not to say that Richard wasn't rich or anything, and he had quite a number of estates, right? Because he's the second son of one of the richest men in the Habsburg Empire. But so he was very well off. But so that's the origin story here, right? Of Richard Ichigo von Coudenhove-Kalergi. He was born of the daughter. He was the son of an aristocrat and a merchant woman, one of Austria and the other of Japan. So that sets the tone for his mixed blood kind of ideologies that he had. He held a lot of these. Well, we can get into that in a bit, actually, for practical
just a little more on his growing up. He lived the first few years in Japan. Then they moved to the family estate in, I guess, Sudetenland.
One of them, yeah.
Czechoslovakia. And his father was very influential on him for the first 6 or 7 years of his life. His father died when Richard was fairly young.
Right, yeah.
And his father Kalergi was very much interested in foreign languages. His father emphasized foreign languages and history and humanities, kind of the education you'd expect of an aristocrat.
So his father was a polyglot. Heinrich was a polyglot, apparently. Knew quite a number of languages. And that's what got him, again, these higher positions, or helped him get these higher positions as far as being an ambassador in so many foreign countries.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're spending 2 years in Turkey, you're going to kind of know Turkish a little bit.
Right.
I mean, unless you're an American State Department employee.
Womp womp.
I'm sorry.
No, he's not.
But so Richard knew, I mean, his main language was German. That's what he wrote everything in.
Right.
He certainly knew French and English decently. And growing up, he'd learned Hungarian and Czech and Japanese, and then bits and pieces of other stuff too.
Which they say totaling somewhere around 13-ish languages.
Yeah, but
which there's no way he was fluent
nobody
in 13.
speaks 13 languages fluently. That's a myth.
Right. That's doesn't work that way.
But yeah, he was very competent in a bunch of languages, and he was very interested from a young age in philosophy.
Yes.
Which is dangerous because, I mean, to take the Greek point of view, you're not supposed to, or take Plato's point of view, you're not supposed to study philosophy until you're over 30. Kalergi studied, when he was at school, he was big into Kant and I think Schopenhauer and just all the German philosophers. And he wrote his first book, Paneuropa, at 25. Which is really young.
Right.
I mean, one might even say immodest. Because how do you expect to write Paneuropa is a book about his vision for how Europe should unite and become sort of like a new United States.
Right.
And that Europe needed to do this because otherwise the other great powers, Russia and the British Empire and East Asia and America would be stronger than Europe, and Europe would just be pulled apart. And he did very much care about European culture, and I think that's genuine. You see it throughout his life. He was very interested in European culture, philosophy, music, everything. He loved
bear in mind that for the listener that the book Paneuropa was written after the First World War.
Okay, that's a good point. Yes, it was written after the First World War, but it was written when he was 25.
Right.
So he almost and he basically was locking himself into this philosophical political position at a very young age, and then continued this project for his entire life. And it showed, I mean, he is very smart, and he clearly was probably better. He was almost certainly better educated than anybody nowadays is at 25. Because,
Easily.
we're at a disadvantage because you have to wade through all the lies and BS to get any sort of realistic picture of the world. Whereas back then, you would have a better education early on. You didn't have to refute. You didn't have to be like, well, gee, should we allow women to run countries?
Right.
That wasn't like an intellectual exercise you had to do.
You weren't dealing with a concept of like, should we allow trans people in sports? They didn't have that.
Right. You didn't have to argue, waste your time with this stuff. The media, the literature wasn't infested with like just disgusting, gross weirdness.
Like both sides of the elites per se understood the concept of racial science and all this other stuff as a given.
You could get to a higher level faster, I would argue.
Yeah, no.
That being said, at 25, you don't know what you're talking about. Right. I mean, unless you're a savant or a music
one of those
composer,
geniuses
one of those
or
two
whatever.
things.
Like a Mozart of some kind. But at that point, that shows itself even further along, even earlier, right, into the lifespan.
Right.
So,
but it shows in Kalergi's works, and Paneuropa just being the first of these, that he wasn't really that intellectually developed, because one of his first things was talking about he posits different like Weltteile, continents, Weltreiche, world empires, political powers, and Weltkulturen,
the world cultures.
World cultures. And the ones he lists, it's almost like he's just kind of he hasn't really grappled with the other big thinkers of the time, like Spengler or I don't know if Chamberlain had written his book yet, the Foundations of the 19th Century.
I think he had.
Kalergi seems like a very superficial take opinion, because he says, okay, the continents that matter are North America, South America, Eurasia, Africa, Australia. All right, the world empires that matter are the British Empire, Russia, America, China, Japan, whoever wins out there.
Yeah, there was like the East Asian concept. It hadn't developed yet. So you had,
and then Europe, or Europe as a potential power, right?
But should it unify, which is the whole point of Paneuropa.
It shows throughout all of his writing and all of his thinking that he hadn't really thought about how do countries form, how do you form a strong state, how do you get a bunch of different countries to work together? What is the difference between a confederation and a real state? Like, why did the United States become a major empire, whereas Austria-Hungary in 1914, 1918 was like being ripped apart?
Right.
Like, what made Austria-Hungary weak that didn't make America weak? Why did Switzerland survive as a multilingual state?
Technically multi-ethnic, if you want
maybe multi-ethnic state, whereas like the Holy Roman Empire didn't. I mean, from our position in history,
right?
But like, why can Switzerland can exist? I think because it's a mountain country.
It's isolated.
It's isolated. Like, nobody has ever tried to conquer Switzerland since like the Romans,
right?
I mean, arguably the Austrians, but not really.
Yeah, it's the fact that it still remains as is because it is isolated and geographically, defensible in a sense. Not that it has a huge military or anything.
No,
but they don't really need it, is the thing. Then Hitler made one quip about going back and dealing with, what do you say? We'll deal with those guys when we get done with Russia or something.
I think Goebbels called them mountain Jews.
Yeah, there's that and the thorn in the side. Like,
very funny.
Right, it's comical. I would imagine that more of those sayings are probably taken out of context to be vitriolic, as compared to just kind of like a funny quip by Germans against other Germanic groups.
When you become a National Socialist and then you go back and read National Socialist stuff, you kind of say, oh yeah,
you could pick out the
make
humor.
These jokes all the time.
Yeah, you
too.
can pick out the humor.
I don't. He obviously wasn't serious about this.
He didn't. It definitely didn't want to eradicate Switzerland or something along those lines. Like, that wasn't the idea, right?
Yeah, but
same thing with Liechtenstein, right? Like, that's been around for quite some time as well.
But let's talk about Kalergi's political philosophy as it developed. I mean, I guess the formative thing in his political development, other than his love of languages and being a cosmopolitan and studying philosophy, honestly, it doesn't seem very deeply.
Right.
The formative political event of his early life was the First World War and the Versailles Treaty and the Saint-Germain Treaty. Kalergi, like many people in Europe, took Wilson at his word with the 14 points and with the League of Nations. And Kalergi thought that this was a great idea and that they ought to have it. But then the years after the World War, or after Versailles, he started to see that it wasn't being implemented anything like in the way that he thought it was going to be implemented.
Right. It was more so. It's like a cover, really. Like it was utilized as a cover for the desires of other empires, and to again, and this kind of comes back to Kalergi speaking on after World War II, where he was upset with England, right, for trying. Yes, we'll get
ahead.
True.
So.
But the fact that it wasn't being implemented the way he was,
yes, one of his big criticisms of the League of Nations was that he thought that it ought to be that each region ought to be represented as a bloc. So rather than having each country come to the United Nations and then have Czechoslovakia argue with the United States or something, Czechoslovakia ought to go to the Europe Regional Council, and then that ought to argue with the North American Regional Council. And he thought that there ought to be some sort of more federal structure that would make it work better, because the League of Nations was notorious for not working.
Right. Because, you had too many chefs in the kitchen for that.
Right. Yeah. So after the First World War, and as he's kind of seeing these developments happen, he became very interested in the idea of uniting Europe in a sort of federation, and basing off the United States or Switzerland or Austria-Hungary. And so he started a movement after he wrote the book Paneuropa, and then he started a movement called the Paneuropa movement. And they had the first conference of the Paneuropa movement was it 1925, 26? It was 26 in Vienna.
Yeah.
And he invited people from all around Europe. He'd been writing letters. I mean, this was a thing throughout his life. He was writing letters to people. He maintained correspondence with people.
His networking was phenomenal.
All over the place.
But he also had a basis for this networking, obviously, given his position.
Yeah, given that he was a count, and that he also had a Jewish wife who was an actress. That was a big help to his networking, because that got him in with all the literate, or not the literate,
literate.
Artsy circles. It got him in there. And his wife was Ida Roland. She was an opera singer.
Yeah.
Very ugly.
You don't say. But
she was very good, because she was a good secretary. Well, and what all men need is a good secretary for their maintaining their correspondence and not dropping pieces here and there. And Kalergi was very good at not forgetting loose ends.
Well, right, and now to kind of slightly dial it back about his philosophy and why he would have married a Jewish woman, and that was very into the arts and everything else like that. He had a serious value of cities. He had a perspective that
he was the cosmopolitan bastard.
Literally, yeah. So going back to the title of this book, he was very much about the concept that culture came from cities, that all the highest culture was germinated inside of these amalgamations of the best people in one specific central area, right? Like Vienna, Berlin, London, Paris, etc.
Yeah.
And so that kind of goes into, again, what we kind of discussed and touched a little bit earlier about his understanding of aristocracy, based on whether it was rustic, which is obviously a rural concept, or the urbanite element of aristocracy, which was the city-dwelling aristocracy. And he very much so envied, or I wouldn't say envy, but he exemplified that element of the urban aristocracy. He really loved that concept, which is why he would marry a Jewish woman that was into opera and all this other stuff. He thought all the culture of Europe came from the cities.
He was a complete snob, is what you're saying.
Very much so, yeah. But that came to that point where he also was very much in the concept of technology, right? They talked about technology a lot in almost all of his writings, about how important it was that Europe maintains an industrial and technological advantage over the other empires, right? Between Russia, he considered Russia's economy to be anarchical, and he also compared that to Europe at the time being anarchical because of all the different independent nations were there and their technological differences and yada yada yada. But he said in order to compete with things like, again, with America specifically, or England for that matter, that Europe itself had to have a technological advantage of some kind, industrial advantage. And that also was part of his conception of why East Asia was eventually going to rise to be a world empire, is because they had the populations, they had the resources to industrialize in a way that Europe honestly couldn't.
Right, and pretty much in all of these things, his thinking is tracking with everybody else's thinking. Hitler was saying a lot of the same things.
Exactly, yeah.
Mackinder was
name one.
Maybe I don't know if he was popular back then, but he had been writing the 1890s. He was saying a lot of the same things. America's a center of power. Europe, East Asia, this was obvious to everybody,
right? And
so he's not going off the wall here.
He's not profound. Also, it's not like he's going off the wall and becoming a prophet or something about this concept.
This is all taken for granted, but
right.
Kalergi versus Hitler, it's an interesting comparison if we go into that for a second, because they both had lived as young men in Vienna. Kalergi was going to the operas and going to the nice hotel bars. Kalergi loved hotels. He always stayed at the Ritz-Carlton everywhere.
Fanciest hotels.
Yes, that was like his one expense. He actually was pretty parsimonious about food and drink. He didn't really eat a lot of fancy food or drink. He mostly just spent money on hotels. But anyway, so he was living the glitzy life,
and Hitler was sleeping on benches in the park.
Sleeping on a bench in a park, and
the duality of man here.
And maybe the evil Mischling tossed him the Reichsmark at
Reichsmark.
a taler at some point. And then Hitler fought in World War I. Kalergi didn't.
Right.
I mean, they almost had exactly opposite life experiences. Hitler was poor. Kalergi was rich. Hitler fought in the war. Kalergi didn't.
Yeah.
Hitler had the grace to take until his 30s before he started writing books. Kalergi didn't.
It's fascinating to see the difference in leadership too.
But they came to fairly similar conclusions about Europe, and that Europe needed to be a world empire if it was to survive as a culture. And Kalergi's idea, what's lacking in Kalergi is he thought that you could just get all the rich people together and then come to an agreement, and then you would have a strong...
Right, everything works.
Everything works. Which, you understand where he's coming from given his background, but he doesn't seem to have grappled with the idea of what about the whole problem of violence or of people wanting to fight each other. He doesn't understand the warrior spirit like the way Hitler did.
Right, and he talks about pacifism a lot in a negative connotation, but doesn't really give an alternative to pacifism, which is a strange thing. I thought reading through all of his work is that
he was involved with the pacifist movement, but he was not a pacifist.
Right.
He was smart enough realistic enough to say, well, war is a thing and we're going to have it. But at the same time, he didn't really have a solution for how we were going to avoid war.
Or conduct it if it was to occur or anything else like that. He just kind of said pacifism's not the good route to take. And then that's it. He didn't delve highly into the other side of things. He called people out for being warmongers. He called... He said that even the basic voter that voted for a pacifist, politician or whatever, and if the politician they voted for was half-hearted in their pacifism, that the voter himself was a warmonger or a half warmonger because of things like this. And so, this was
okay.
And so he really he had a whole chapter in practical realism practical idealism about this pacifistic element of why he was criticizing pacifism. But at the same time, there is no passage about the antithesis, about how do you go about actually enacting pacifism in a way that is viable. He only criticized the people that were, in a sense, hindering pacifism, or how the pacifists were warmongers. So there was kind of this contradictory element, I would say, to his conceptions of pacifism, to where he didn't necessarily like it, but he also hailed it as being the best thing in the world. And it was that was a strange read for me whenever I was going through specifically practical idealism on that, and also the emancipation of women. Yeah, we can go on forever, right? You know this about all sorts of, and not to say they were contradictory, but again, nuances about how people just simply thought at the time, about how they conducted themselves in politics. And his idea, as we go back to your point, he didn't really seem to have a really good developed grasp on the philosophical elements of politics, I would imagine.
So he started the Paneuropa movement, and he basically was able to get, at his first conference in Vienna, he was able to get people from all over Europe. Yeah. And we're talking big names, like I think Einstein was there.
Yeah, he was.
Thomas Mann.
Yeah, Churchill.
Was Churchill there?
Yeah.
Churchill was at that one.
He had all the big names of Europe, and people commented on that in the press. They were like, "This is amazing. We've never seen a conference like this in Europe. A continental congress unlike any other."
Which it almost brings up the question of, like, was Kalergi an absolute genius, or was it just that everybody was thinking along the same lines, and maybe this is a genius. He saw where everything was going and said, all right, let's get everybody in a room and just do this.
I think it's a little bit of both, honestly. The fact that he did have some foresight to that of like, okay, this is the direction everybody's thinking of. Let's collect everybody in one room and talk about it. Right.
Yeah.
On top of that, though, I would say there's a bit of luck and a little bit of providence. The fact that, yes, he is just a count who has all these connections, has all this great networking at his foot, and he just kind of took the initiative and did what
his was not the only game in town. There were other movements that were sort of going along the same lines. There was the European Culture Bund.
Yeah.
That was, I guess they had conferences where they tried to bring people together to talk about art and literature.
But it wasn't focused. This is the thing, is that it wasn't focused on the concept of not to say a one world government, a one Europe government, right? Like that was I think what made it unique, is that he really took the concept of a pan-European leadership to its not natural conclusion, but at the time its supposed conclusion.
Yeah. So I think there were 3 Paneuropa conferences before World War II. There was Vienna, then
they had one in London, didn't they?
They had Vienna. It was the first big one, and then I think they had one at Berlin, if I'm remembering right.
Berlin, I think that's what triggered Hitler to ban, well, also the annexation of Austria too. He banned, obviously, Kalergi from the Reich.
Yeah, there was a funny story about that. The night of the Machtergreifung, Kalergi was having a meeting with some other internationalists at this hotel.
Go figure.
Always at the hotel.
Right, yeah.
But the Nazis had come in and taken like the main meeting rooms first, and the hotel staff insisted that Kalergi and for their own safety, they had to use the side entrance. Humiliated.
They
had to go talk about their internationalist conspiracies in the closet while like Hitler and all the cool guys like were hanging around in the lobby.
Right.
It's like the ultimate humiliation.
And he fled Vienna at that point in time. Which I'm pretty sure he went to London, if that's
No. So remember he goes after the Nazis took over in Germany. He ran away to back to Vienna.
Yeah.
And then he was there for a little while. Then there was
the
Anschluss.
Yeah.
And his account of it is in Conflum Europa, is hilarious, because he and his wife had to flee, and they couldn't drive because they never learned to drive. I mean, Hitler didn't either, so I guess it was kind of a normal thing back then.
Right.
It was like cool people don't drive,
yeah.
So you had to have a driver, and they couldn't find one. I think the Swiss embassy lent them a car and a driver to get out, and the driver at one point realized that he didn't have his passport or something and was like, can we go back to your house? And so they had to like drive back somewhere. He had to hop out, run inside and get the passport. Meanwhile, like the stormtroopers are like raging, and the German army and all the Austrian Nazis are like partying in the streets, and everyone's like, and it's just this funny image because the way he describes it, all the Germans and all the Nazis are all really happy, and he's like scared out of his mind, and he thinks that they're all going to like lynch him, like just right there.
Right. Honestly, everybody was more worried about just taking the next shot of Jaeger. So like,
nobody
really
cared. It's like, dude, nobody cares about your stupid little thing.
Yeah,
they're just going to let you go.
Now, if they were smart, they would have lynched him. But
yes, right. But if they weren't such nice, polite guys,
right?
They would have.
Dunkirk, but.
So yeah, he got away, drove to the border, and all the other rats fled Vienna at the same time, and they all fled to.
And that's another thing. It's like the National Socialists at the border guards, they didn't stop him. It's not like they just like it's Kalergi.
Well, I'm sure it was still the Austrian army technically or whatever.
Yeah, still, but
there were. I think the Gestapo was chasing him, and they weren't able to get him, and he and hundreds of other Austrian like fat cats ended up in Pressburg. Bratislava.
Oh, right. And
he bitches about it in the book. He bitches that like, we got to the Ritz-Carlton and just there was no room for us.
Because all the other people were fleeing at the same time. So
yeah, they had to have drinks in the lobby with all the
plebs.
All the plebs. And then he had to. So then the way he fled is he drove. He had to like drive around. He had to drive clockwise around Austria to get to Switzerland, and he was buds with Mussolini, sort of. And Mussolini was kind enough to send him a couple or a few black shirts to escort him through Italian territory.
Right. And then on an aside, just so everybody knows at this time, there was a political divide between National Socialism and fascism, and Mussolini at the time was fearful that during the Anschluss that they would go after southern Tyrol and get that back from the
Right. There was
War.
some question as to whether Austria or whether Germany and Italy might go to war.
Exactly. So there would have been a reason, or not, there would not have been a reason to collaborate with Hitler on stopping Kalergi from going through Italian territory.
So he got to Switzerland, and then he went to France. You know, it's kind of like reading those Holocaust books, like about the girl who flees one country and then the German army like crashes into that country, and then she has to flee to another country. It was kind of like those,
except with the Ritz-Carlton.
Except he's staying at the Ritz-Carlton. They're driving. What is it? Were they driving a Rolls-Royce everywhere?
I think so. Yeah, it was a very expensive car at the time. It was not low profile. Let's put it that way. There's nothing he did was low profile.
So yeah, then. When the 1940 invasion of France happened, he fled to Spain. Had to get a driver to take him and Ida Roland to the Spanish border. The Spaniards let him in again.
Yeah,
lack of solidarity and lack of foresight. Franco was a
it was
about Franco.
It was an interesting situation.
And then Kalergi spent a few weeks like crying about how he couldn't get a flight to America because the line was so long. Because all the other fat cats again wanted to get out of Europe and get to America, but he managed. I forget exactly what it was, but it talks about it in the book. He was able to get out of Spain, by basically just jumping to the front of the line.
He went to London at some point. I can't remember when it was though. There was some point where he was taking refuge there.
I don't know. He went. I know he went, and he definitely was in London after the war, and I think he might have also visited or met Churchill before the war. Because
I know he spoke with Churchill quite a bit before in the conferences.
Right.
And then, definitely after the war, though, that's where his big headbutting with Churchill came into play.
Yeah.
Because again, he saw that Churchill, again, this is where he comes into the concept where he thought that England was too just kind of ingrained with its own empire.
There's this question in the Paneuropa movement of where does England fit into all this?
Right, exactly.
Because is England part of Europe, or is England the British Empire, and is it separate? And can we bring England into Europe, or does England belong with America?
Or does England want to simply unite Europe under itself? And that was another thing, because again, like while that would have been the same concept that Hitler had with Germany, is that you're uniting Europe under Germany. And Kalergi had a big issue with this, which is why he didn't want to have one dominant nation in Europe. He wanted to have, as you pointed out earlier, a cobbled effect or a stitched together empire, right, of all these different European states. And he kind of was seeing that England didn't want that either, that England wanted to have a Europe united under England itself, right, as making it part of the British Empire. And he even specifically said, quote, that he was worried that it was going to become part of the Commonwealth.
And there were sort of several iterations of it too, because early on in Paneuropa, it was Germany that he was focusing on, mainly Germany, and then in France kind of secondarily. Yeah. But then when the Nazis took over Germany, he was like, okay, well, we have to have France and Italy have to be the core here. Germany's out. Maybe we can get Austria, France, Italy, and then that's like a good core to work around. But then when Hitler took it all,
right, and made fortress Europe,
he had to flee to America, and then he got set up. When he got to America, he got set up pretty quickly with a cushy job at Columbia.
But wasn't that his wife's doing though? Because again, her connections with the New York people.
Well, yeah, he was welcome anywhere he went.
True.
So he had a nice job at Columbia while he was in America, still doing pushing the Paneuropa movement, still staying in contact with everybody. And he was trying to get a meeting with Roosevelt. I don't think he ever did. He did meet with Truman, if I remember right. He did meet the president, but he wasn't able to early on get that meeting. And
because he also not established those ties prior to any of this too, which was a big deal for him.
Right.
Because like again, he was focusing specifically on Europe, not at the time there was no such concept as a one world government. Like that wasn't really a thing. Like the League of Nations existed, but as you said earlier, he had a lot of issues with that.
Yeah. I know early on, William Donovan, the head of the OSS, who I don't know if you know anything about him. I've heard he was a complete slime bag.
Don't say.
He was, I mean, yeah, you're a spy chief. What else are you going to be?
Right.
Was pushing Kalergi, and then he kind of backed off it. Kalergi was back and forth when he was in America in terms of, was he in favor, was he out of favor?
Right.
But he was able to sort of set things up in his time in America to have the post-war situation be what he wanted it to be. So he was talking to Churchill, and he was sort of putting his propaganda out there about how he wanted the UN to be set up, because remember, Churchill and Roosevelt were setting up the United Nations at the time, and the Russians were collaborating with that. So all this was going on, and Kalergi was still like hammering his points about how we want a united Europe,
because he was fearful that Europe would have been left out of this, and he
was
for
right.
the most part was right. Yeah.
And so his biggest friend in Europe became, during the war years, or in like just immediately after the war, was de Gaulle.
Right.
Because
that was
he had this problem with Britain.
Yeah.
Where he wasn't really, he was buds with Churchill, and Churchill always had him over for drinks and stuff, but
tea
and well, yeah, and Churchill was always chomping on a cigar and downing whiskey.
Yeah, God.
Kalergi was more abstemious, but Churchill was.
We could go on for days about Churchill.
Churchill was, yeah.
God.
But Kalergi did keep his options open, and so he was in correspondence with de Gaulle in Algiers in the war years, and then afterwards, immediately after the war, he started trying to rebuild Paneuropa mainly around France, but his main push was Franco-German reconciliation.
Right, which was extremely difficult at the time.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Like, yeah, we just wrecked your country.
So come back and do all this stuff, even though we're going to, destroy your entire infrastructure. Because, again, that was, part of Kalergi's concern was the concept of technology, and the Ruhr Valley was the big deal for Germany at the time for production, and it was obliterated. At the behest of the English and American air forces. So
how did it all turn out? We've kind of covered 30 years from basically World War I to the end of World War II.
Right.
Kalergi still had another 30 years of life.
Right, and this is when this is where the European Union starts to come into play.
And I'll just say from reading the book, like, honestly, the period from World War I to the end of World War II is the most interesting.
Yeah.
It's probably the last like 75 or 100 pages of the book are less interesting.
But the thing is that
because it's really getting down to like minutia of just trying to like hammer out the details.
But it does come into the concept of what is his legacy, and how does that play into the world that we are now living in with the European Union?
Because he got what he wanted.
Theoretically he did.
Yeah.
Mostly the concept. I think that he got the names that he wanted for things, but that's not necessarily that. Because again, I think that can be even a bigger and longer conversation. Is what is the legacy of Kalergi as compared to Kalergi's initial inroads into Pan-Europa, and how did that become the European Union, which seemingly, according to Kalergi's writings itself, are almost two completely different things as far as what is actually being created and what's being done.
What's the difference?
Well, that's the thing.
We've got a European Confederation.
Well, we do to an extent, but it's how it's being done, and that's the thing with the immigration, the concept. Again, the Eurasian Negroid element. How did that actually play out to the lower orders? What's the deal with the immigration issue? How much influence do Jews actually now play in the European Union compared to Europeans? Right, like that's a big issue specifically. And kind of just the degradation of the liberal world order into the degeneracy that we see now as compared to Kalergi's real vision for European culture.
Well, he certainly was a culture snob, and I think he would be appalled at the degradation of culture.
Oh, yeah.
No doubt about that. And I think he also would have hated the European Union, or what NATO, European Union, the arrangements that exist today, because these states are just a vassal of American power.
Right, exactly.
And that's exactly what he was trying to prevent.
Right, and in a sense, that's why Pan-Europa didn't actually come to fruition. The European Union is, in a sense, completely different than what Pan-Europa was supposed to be, because Pan-Europa was supposed to be sovereign.
Kalergi got co-opted.
Yeah, he did, really. Because Europe was supposed to be sovereign. Europe is clearly, as of today, not sovereign. There's militaries from both the English Empire and the American Empire throughout Europe. Germany's still an occupied country, right? So,
right. And I mean, England isn't really an empire, but like it's
Right.
kind of like an adjunct to the American sea empire.
It fell out after England lost its empire and fell out of favor with itself, essentially. Like, it just became a puppet state, in a sense, to America. And then by that way of being a puppet, facilitated America's domination of Western Europe. And as of current, we're now seeing a resurgence. And then Europe, because obviously Europe is being now torn apart between the Russian Empire and the American Empire, and that's exactly what Kalergi didn't want to have.
And he was. I read. Where did I read it? I read a quote of his, or there's several quotes to this effect, where he delineates Europe as being no farther than the eastern borders of Romania and Poland.
Right.
Which, dude, explicitly excludes the Ukraine.
Right.
It's pretty clear on that point.
And
the
Baltics too, which is surprising.
No, he actually says he wanted to have. He thought it was a better idea to have buffer states,
Well,
and to
it's a
treat
smart idea.
basically Poland, Finland, Romania would be buffer states, would be neutral, be given like their own, allowed to have their own foreign policy, as long as they didn't like become
vassals of
a vassal of Russia or of Europe, America.
They had to maintain their sovereignty in a sense.
Yeah. As we see right now, that his vision is not playing out whatsoever.
At all.
America is just using Europe as a tool to creep into the
Well,
Far
it's NATO.
East.
NATO's they're utilizing it as a weapon for NATO in a sense, or however that plays out. So yeah, it's I would say that Kalergi had an interesting vision, but it just hasn't come.
Well,
to fruition.
okay, so that was the geopolitical, but you were just bringing up some of the more social aspects, like. Geopolitically, yes, Kalergi's vision has not come true because the European states are just vassals of Washington,
right?
For all intents and purposes. I mean, to go off on a side thing here, people talk about, could the Germans like get into a block with Russia because they get all their energy from Russia, and that's what Washington's afraid of? To my mind, it's not even a question. Like, that's just not. There is no way, like, Germany is too tied to America and too much under the thumb of American power for that to even really be a question. It was obvious that as soon as the Ukraine war broke out, that Germany was going to have to cut off Nord Stream 2 and not participate with Russia in that.
Which is foolish for Germany. That's the thing, is like
it is in their interests, perhaps.
Well, the thing is, like, nothing that the European Union is doing is within the European Union's interest. That's
I'm not saying it's not in Germany's interest to work with Russia, but I'm saying their elites are so compromised and they're total slaves of American power.
There's no fear. There's no fear of them becoming part of a Russian bloc. There just isn't at all. But the thing is, if Europe was to become sovereign, like Kalergi would have envisioned, Germany would easily, because of its output, industrial output, again, as Kalergi talked about technology, would naturally become the leader of the European Union, as it kind of already is, because it does have, and I hate to use this term because it is the most absolute outrageous concept to even put as far as a metric for nations, the GDP is higher than all the other European nations. So, you have these aspects where Germany would normally become sovereign, but again, to your point, their government is so absolutely cucked that there's no way that they would ever become part of a Russian bloc. There's just no way.
So that's the geopolitical aspect. His Kalergi's vision didn't happen, but looking at the social aspect, what he wanted, he loved European culture. That didn't happen.
Right.
European culture is in the toilet.
Completely destroyed.
But as far as immigration, though, it would seem, I mean, based on his one infamous quote, it would seem that is coming true.
Well, to an extent, but he also mentioned that at the time, Europe was considered by him to be overpopulated. And the fact that they're increasing their population even more so now is in direct antithesis to what he was discussing. So what I'm assuming that he meant by a Eurasian Negroid grouping or whatever was that, there could have been some amalgamation, and this gets into the more esoteric elements of Kalergi, this bit of the conversation, because he did mention quite a bit about ancient Egypt and how that power structure worked as far as who was ruling it as compared to the lower orders. Lower orders being this kind of amalgamation of racial groups that were, again, it kind of evolved into that they're smart enough to work but too stupid to vote kind of thing.
Right. I mean, he thought of ancient Egypt, and he's probably right that ancient Egypt for the last 1,500 or 1,000 years of its history was a an overclass of intellectual priest types and then a vast underclass of fellaheen, mixed race fellaheen, even better.
They were
who were completely controllable
and almost multi-ethnic as well, based on the Nubians, and you had the Hittite groups and everything else that had come into Egypt over the course of the times. You had this mixture that had occurred.
And he wanted to he thought that was like a good political model, which,
in a sense, the concept of keeping the lower classes, I hate to say this, but like in their place, right, by genetics, that was kind of the way to do it, is to maintain it, like, because he didn't. Well,
if you don't have a warrior aristocrat elite, you have an intellectual nerd faggot elite,
right?
Your people aren't going to respect you, and they're going to overthrow you unless you can breed them into a bunch of self-hating mongrels.
Right, and that plays into a lot of the racial science that was happening at the turn of the century that not just Kalergi, but everybody was in the understanding of, right? It just comes down to, how do you play that out? How, like, it's either you're going to go to what the German concept was to make everybody elevated and to be like this elite Aryan, racial group, where it was like a mass movement towards we're
going to improve ourselves. We're not as, it was Hitler basically put it, we're not as racially well developed and as pure as the Americans, but we're going to get there.
Damn, that's see how that went. But that's kind of the thing.
But it's just the exact opposite of what they tell you. He said, it's like Hitler was clear that he thought the Americans of the early 20th century were like genetically better.
And the reason for that being is because they were this is going to sound strange, but that they were a mixed race. Not that they were mixed between multiple actual races that we would denote now, but between European races.
They were the best elements of Europe.
Yeah, it was the best of the French, of the Germans, of the English, of the Italians, and all that other stuff combined into an amalgamation of one truly hybrid race of Europeans. And I think, honestly, that is probably what Kalergi was getting at more so.
He did say Negroid, though.
He did.
It's hard to tiptoe around that one.
That is true, right? The Eurasian Negroid part of it. That's. To be fair, though, I'm wondering if he didn't want that element simply because it would have brought them down to be a deliberate lower class as compared to the upper classes, right? Knowing, again, from his background, he did have that concept from his grandfather that the lower orders are just playthings for the aristocracy and everything else of that nature, so that he did see it divide. And that's not really a far cry either from British philosophy either. We have like I forgot what the specific area was, but they looked at the lower orders almost as a different race as compared to the upper classes, and that's a play out throughout a lot of European philosophy coming into the racial sciences.
Everybody, as you were saying, like everybody pretty much agreed that this is how things work. The main difference between Kalergi and Hitler was Kalergi was like, this is good,
right?
Hitler was like, this is bad.
Yeah, and we need to do something to repair this.
And then Spengler was saying, this is going to happen anyway.
This is inevitable. Like, this is good, this is bad, this is inevitable. So you have 3 different takes on history. And but that's kind of the thing. And to be fair, though, I absolutely don't think what Kalergi meant was what's going on right now. Like, the forced integration of it, the difference in culture was a big deal, the destruction of European culture. Also, just the rampant amount of immigration. I don't think Kalergi wanted to replace Europeans wholesale like they're doing currently. And it has gone completely out of control. And, I mean, let's be real here. It is because of Jewish taint on this ideology. They have a complete disdain for Europe, or what they call it, Edom, right? Edom has to be destroyed in the Jewish mindset, and this is one of the ways they're destroying it.
But Kalergi certainly liked Jews, and he thought...
But he only liked them because they were a hybrid. He thought them to be an elite hybrid race.
But correct me if I'm wrong. But he thought that the European elite ought to be heavily Jewish.
Yes,
or at least cosmopolitan. Not in the real meaning of the word of worldly and maybe a little bit mixed. Cosmopolitan, right. Highly educated.
Because Kalergi kind of saw Jews as not really being like, while obviously they were their own race, but he really idealized the Jew as being an example of what a highbrow mixed racial group could be, right? Like that they were like the elite hybrids is what he was looking at them as, and that he wanted something similar for Europe.
And it makes sense that if you're a person like Kalergi who just idolizes being smart and you don't think highly of people who are tough or are brave,
right?
You're the priest type, not the warrior type.
And he also comes
you're gonna like worship Jews.
Right, exactly. And on top of that, he himself was of mixed race origin, right? So like he's going to gravitate towards, okay, who is the most elite of these mixed race groups? And at the time, he
was an aspiring Jew.
Right, exactly. And another reason why he married into Jewishness, because that was something that he desired for his offspring.
He twice married Jewesses, his first and I believe his third wife.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, I know. One of his wives wasn't.
So he was like, that doesn't work too well. And he went back to his old ways.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think that again, that was co-opted. That's the whole concept of what is going on currently is that it's as most things that the Jews corrupt is that they take something that is fundamentally understandable by most people and then they run with it to an extreme.
Speaking of, so it's just funny, we're talking about Kalergi being mixed race. It's just funny because his elder brother and his younger brother were like total Nazis.
Right.
As Mischlings in the Third Reich. Actually, even before the Third Reich, his younger brother, I forget his name, the third son, right below him, fought in the Austro-Hungarian army and was on the Italian front in the last days of the war and like had been a fairly successful junior officer.
Right.
As a Mischling.
Well,
imagine like Battle of Caporetto or Vittorio Veneto, and you jump into this trench and you're like, you see a dude in Austrian uniform who looks like a Jap.
Yeah. What's your name?
Hands up. Hold on.
Where are you
Everyone
from?
stop shooting.
Just call like a ceasefire real quick.
We need to talk about what's going on here.
Yeah. Are they importing mercenaries? So yeah,
but the same brother in World War II was on the staff of von Kleist.
Well, it makes sense because the Germans and Japanese were allied. It would have made more sense for Kalergi to join.
Well, yeah, it made more sense in World War II, sure.
Yeah,
but I don't know if you remember this from the book. I found this hilarious. Kalergi made I guess it was a radio diatribe, and he trash talked Hitler and said Hitler was a bad military leader. Hitler got really angry.
You don't say.
And fired all of Kalergi's relatives from anywhere within the German bureaucracy. So Kalergi's younger brother lost his job as a staff officer with von Kleist and had to like go home and chill out for the rest of the war. And then Kalergi's
probably smart though.
Older brother had inherited the estate back in Sudetenland.
Yeah.
And funny story, Kalergi had back in the 1920s tried to prevent his elder brother from inheriting because he thought his elder brother was insane. Didn't go over. The elder brother got it. But then during the war, his elder brother was super pro-Nazi, would just invite all the Nazi local officials and had big parties with them. And so I don't know. It's like it's just funny because
the dichotomy of man within one family.
The elder brother, the younger brother are both the same exact racial genetic background.
Yeah,
turned out okay.
Yeah,
and then Richard just
right. But I think that goes to again the delving into specific elements of philosophy, right? And like how there is some truth to the concept of nurture over nature in those elements, right? Like obviously nature is the foundation of everything, but there is a truth to the concept of nurture involved in this. You know, it's not just 100% nature of how one is raised. I think the concept that you were older in this, like that him being the older one and getting the boon of the Austro-Hungarian Empire bestowed upon him with the estates and everything else from his father Heinrich, he was able to more so position himself in a way that he would have seen the National Socialist uprising as being a favorable thing that he could get himself involved into. Because again, Hitler was reinstating aristocracy that had been deposed after the First World War and the Revolution, right? Like
it wasn't reinstated. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Let's just be clear to anybody listening. Like, it's not
right.
Hitler was against the aristocracy, but he put up with them.
Well, because there was a value he saw in their bloodlines and all this other stuff. There was a value to the concept of governance, right? That he saw there with the rustic aristocracy or the aristocracy in general, compared to just strictly voting. Because obviously we know that wasn't like the base motto was democracy was not their MO. So there was a value that the elder Kalergi would have seen to the rise of National Socialism and being put into the position where my estates are not going to be taken away. Because again, like the Weimar Revolution after the fall of the Kaiser was extremely anti-aristocracy, right? Anti-monarchy and all this other stuff. So Hitler being more in favor was the better way to go than the new liberal democratic revolutionaries that were just
It was better
taking
than supporting Masaryk.
Right, exactly.
Well,
'cause,
I guess he was dead at the time, but whoever was in charge of
the point being, though, is
Czechoslovakia.
people were being removed from their ancestral positions, and it was better to go with people that were not going to remove you from this position.
Yeah. I'll throw in a couple more things we skipped over on Kalergi's youth and upbringing that probably go into why he did the things he did. One was he was a big Freemason.
Oh, we forgot to mention that entirely.
He was a huge Freemason, and a lot of his associates were Freemasons.
Yeah.
And, we...
Not
in another
conspiracy
podcast,
theories.
we talked about Raymer and how Otto Ernst Raymer, in one of his books, criticizes the Freemasons as being responsible for World War I. And, from our perspective in 2022, I mean, Freemasons are just kind of like weirdos who maybe have a club somewhere.
Like to wear robes and do weird shit.
But, I mean, back then, I don't know about now, but back then it was clearly a very powerful or influential organization.
It was a networking group, for sure.
And Hitler was very much against the Freemasons. I mean, just because, not just the Freemasons, but any secret society is antithetical to the idea of National Socialism.
Right.
Because how can you have a secret society can't be an elite? An elite has to lead openly and overtly, in Hitler's idea.
A true elite, right, yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with Hitler, as I think we all do.
Yeah.
So the Freemasons are just like this inverted, backwards elite. It's fake LARP elite.
Hide in the shadows.
Your people are being promoted based on how much ass they can kiss.
Yeah.
Not on how noble they are, how worthy they are. And so necessarily an organization like the Freemasons is going to foster or develop an elite that is not noble,
conniving,
and not worthy of being followed.
Right.
And that's not going to...
But they have to connive against their population in order to rule. That's the big issue there. That's I would imagine why this concept
why
of Kalergi,
Freemasonry was so popular.
Well, not just that, but like why Kalergi's ideas were so popular specifically, and that we can just breed down our population so that they're too stupid to even fight against us.
Were realizing then, as they are now, that they're not worthy to lead,
right?
And that the only way they can stay in power is by terrorizing everybody else.
Well, and they even said that specifically in like one of the latest congresses of the World Economic Forum, where they're like, "Oh, all these elites are getting together, but the problem is that nobody trusts the elites." Well, no shit, no one trusts the elites. Like, they're a bunch of conniving, conspiracy theorists. So of course, no one's going to trust them on the ground level. So they have to breed us down so that we don't not that we don't trust them, it's that we're too stupid to trust them. Or not trust them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I think, where they're taking the perverted element of Kalergi's ideas and putting it into practice.
The other element from his early days, high school, he went to the Theresianum. It was a high school named after Maria Theresa of Austria-Hungary.
The enlightened absolutist monarch of Hungary back then.
Yeah. And the high school was like, it was like Georgetown. It was one of those schools, or I don't know, Deerfield or Hotchkiss or something. Yeah. It was one of these, except more elite than those, because people back then cared about more about this stuff.
Real academic.
I don't know. I think it was the school in Austria-Hungary that if you were rich and you were part of the elite. And I think 100 years before they'd allowed in merchant children, but they were still
Right.
pretty top tier, and that's where he went to school. And so I kind of feel sympathy for him because I had a similar high school experience not an elite school. It's higher. It was a very diverse environment, and diversity can work in a fairly controlled environment.
It has to be a lab-controlled way.
You don't notice the obvious problems, but then you have to be able to abstract and look at, okay, well, politically, this might be working, but is it working as well as other political arrangements?
Right.
Then, no.
Yeah,
but
no, definitely not.
Kalergi wasn't really one to think deductively. Well, he did think deductively.
I think it was circumstantially deductive.
He looked, the point I'm trying to make is he looked at his high school, he looked at the ethnic diversity, and even to an extent the racial diversity.
Right.
Because there were people from outside Austria-Hungary. There were Indians and Japanese and some of the classes.
But again, it's the elites of those groups at the time.
Right.
It wasn't just your base. And that's the issue currently, where it's just like, we'll just import mass people from foreign countries, and then it's just going to work. Well, no, you're literally importing the worst of the worst.
But you can have diverse. You can sort of have a school of elites from all over the world. But if you're going to stick low class, or like basically every white and black and Hispanic together in schools randomly, there's just going to be racial hatred.
It's
fighting.
chaos.
It's going to be total chaos, and the whites are going to come out the worst of it.
Right, exactly, because they're the ones suffering it because it's in their own nations, and that's kind of the big issue, is that you have these. You already pointed it out. Like that's kind of the issue, is that you have this understanding that diversity is great only in the context of it being the elites of those diverse groups as compared to the lowest. And that's the thing, most of the people coming over as immigrants are not anywhere near the elites. They are the bottom tier, because even the best people from those countries know not to leave their own homelands. They have it good in their own homelands because they're making their homelands better than what they would have been. That's the problem with
when you define best, what you mean is the most like moral and responsible people from Nigeria or whatever,
right? They are
staying home because they want to improve their own homeland.
Yeah, because they love their country.
Whereas
they
the
love
crassest and most greedy, and perhaps the most capable, but
still
the least moral,
right? The most psychologically dysgenic people will come across the seas to capitalize on the free gibs of foreign
There
nations.
might be a few. I mean, you might have a few who come.
Yeah, but like
you might have a few who come to make money, send it home, and then return home. You do see that.
Yeah, but
as a
the
general
percentage
trend,
is very, very low.
Yeah.
That's I think the unfortunate downfall of that's the rise of Kalergi's concept of Paneuropa, and then the sin of the European Union now is to corrupt his ideologies.
All right, let's. I want to close out here, but we ask a couple questions. We can talk these through. Do you admire Kalergi, William?
All right, so we'll do this question by question then. All right, so do I admire Kalergi? Yes and no. It's a hard one. I do admire how on point he is with a lot of things, specifically with the racial science element, the concept of his rustic and urban aristocracy aspects, and we didn't really delve too much into that as far as the minutia of it, but as far as how he describes these interworkings of relations, I think he's very much an underappreciated philosopher, or quote unquote philosopher.
I say philosopher. I will say political thinker,
political analyst, I suppose, would be a way to go. But yeah, as far as that is concerned, I do admire. I think he was. There was a better class of villain back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, I would much rather have a conversation with Kalergi than
Angela Merkel.
Angela Merkel, or I don't know, Jack Posobiec. Like, yeah, I'll take the race mixing and
right.
Everything, all the bad with if I can just talk to Kalergi rather than some moron like
what's the thing? So
evil moron like Jack Posobiec.
Would I choose Kalergi over Klaus Schwab any day of the week?
There's a good comparison.
Right, the head of the World Economic Forum currently, right? He's doing the exact same thing Kalergi was doing, but in a completely ridiculous way.
Doesn't he own a bank?
Schwab? I don't know if he does or not. No, he owns BlackRock. Which is
because Schwab is a bank, isn't it?
I don't know if it's his bank, though.
There used to be a bank called Schwab Bank.
I don't know if it's his. It might have been his family's, because he is from Switzerland, right? So he's a Swiss guy. I know.
Cuckoo clocks, chocolate, and banks.
Back to Switzerland, right? So the thing is, though, is that he is doing the same thing by uniting the world's industrial and technological powers behind him, right? With BlackRock and with the World Economic Forums. And he has all these like the green plans, like the Great Reset, and the Great Narrative, and all this other stuff. He's doing a very sick, warped version of it. But at the same time, again, Kalergi had the better concept, was more well informed, and was more forthright with his ideologies. I think the concept that he put racial understanding at like the forefront. It was just kind of an understanding that Kalergi had, where Schwab is just suppressing all of that to just be straight propaganda consistently. So Schwab is more of that secret society kind of guy that is dirty and underhanded, and utilizes propaganda more so to his advantage than Kalergi did, where Kalergi was kind of open with most of his dealings, which I think was, again, these are the better villains.
Yeah, he wrote a ton of books.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
laid it all out there.
right. And like I own now, unfortunately, I've now purchased all of Schwab's books, and I'm going to tell you right now, Kalergi was the better writer. He had the better ideology, and he's the better villain. Kalergi is the better villain than Schwab. So, all right, next question then.
I'll say qualified like yes, no on admiring him.
Yeah,
it's like he's still bad, but like you can understand him in his error.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
These other people.
Yeah, I know it's a mystery. Honestly, it's at times as to what it is that they're actually going for, besides just the cult of finance.
Yeah. We kind of already covered some of this other stuff. Let's see.
We can just
Kalergi's virtually forgotten today. Should he be considered a major figure?
Personally, I would say yes. Honestly, I think that he's one of those forgotten guys, and I think on purpose. Honestly, I think he's forgotten on purpose because he is the better villain. The fact that he is the better option.
Well, he was having meetings with like Churchill, right? As soon as he gets off the boat coming back from America in 1946, he's having lunch with Churchill.
Right.
I mean, I guess Churchill was out of power at the time. He was still a major political figure, and he could get meetings with Mussolini, with Schuschnigg or Dollfuss or Masaryk or
De Gaulle.
De Gaulle. Who was before De Gaulle?
Oh,
he was
God.
big died in 1928. French premier. I forget.
I hate to be an asshole with some irrelevant French politician.
Yeah, whatever. He was all these French people, and
right.
By that I mean Europeans.
Yeah.
Like he just got meetings. He just like, if you're able to meet with all these people, it sort of follows that you are somebody important.
But that's the thing, is I think that it was deliberate in the fact that he has forgotten. Because, again, if people were to get a hold of this information of what Kalergi wanted for the European Union, they would see how divergent the current EU is from Paneuropa. They would see that what the direction it's going in currently is just a puppet state as compared to the sovereign empire that Kalergi had envisioned.
Which is, so I guess, why we could posit maybe why this stuff hasn't been translated in English, so much of it.
Because they don't want it to be. That's the same. There's a reason why Schwab has been translated into 80 different languages, but he hasn't. Kalergi hasn't.
Just on a technical point of view, like the rights to these books are owned by the Paneuropa movement or whatever its successor is.
Though the European Union,
the European Union owns the rights.
It even has there's symbology on all of these things. Yeah.
And you would think English. The European Union and the globalists are all about pushing English on everybody.
Right.
So you'd think they would have translated these into English and pushed Paneuropa in English. Paneuropa does exist in English. I've got a copy, but it's like machine translated.
It's probably not. But that's the thing. It's probably not an official translation. Is the thing, and that's kind of the deal. Is that again, to my point, I don't think they want it translated. I don't think they want it mass disseminated, because if more people knew what the original plan of Pan-Europa and the European Union was supposed to be, they would see what's going on now, and they might actually revolt.
So did our boy Martin Bond here, who wrote Hitler's Cosmopolitan Bastard, has he accidentally subverted the European Union?
It's a faux pas, man. He screwed up.
Martin Bond has enjoyed 3 careers: journalist, academic, European civil servant. He taught West European studies in Northern Ireland, BBC correspondent in Berlin, was spokesman for the Council of Ministers in Brussels, directed the London office of European Parliament, and now advises University of Surrey's Jean Monnet Center, blah, blah, blah.
I think that was a screw up.
Because he spent 5 or 7 years, I think, writing this book, and he uses, there's all the German and French sources and English sources that he uses. I guess he screwed up. We have to mention it. One thing we did note reading this book is Martin Bond mentions that there is a unpublished Kalergi book in manuscript form that's held at the archives, some town in Switzerland, not Zurich, not Geneva, some pastoral.
No, it's I remember. Yeah, it's northeast of Geneva. There's a small town,
Vaud or something like that.
It's some weird town, but it's a small town on the same road going northeast of Geneva. It's about 30 to 45 minutes outside of Geneva by drive. if that.
Yeah, we looked because we might have to
wanted
go
this so
find
badly.
this manuscript. So it's a manuscript in German. I think it's mostly typed. Maybe some of it's still handwritten, and it's called The Amazons.
Yes.
And
Now, which is funny that he would talk about that, because in Practical Idealism, he specifically talks about how the emancipation of women was a bad idea. But he also talks about, obviously in Der Amazonen, as it is, right, that there is this historical aspect of matriarchy, which is an interesting thing. Now, to be fair, considering none of us have read it yet, because it's over.
I don't think anybody's read it.
Right, and I would imagine that somewhere within that, he actually describes how matriarchy is probably not a good thing, judging on the rest of his works elsewhere. And
Because he spent like the last several years of his life writing this book.
and it honestly might have not been published on purpose, because it would have been a damning concept of emancipation of women.
That's pretty funny.
Right.
Somebody's gonna have to get us a copy.
I want a copy very badly.
I guess we could call. I was thinking we maybe just call them up and ask for photocopies.
Yeah,
send them a
PDF,
check,
please.
or send them Venmo them some money, and we could get photocopies of it.
Here's a couple grand. Just put it here, please.
Yeah, I would be very interested to know what's in that book. I mean, it might have just be. It might. On the other hand, it might just be total insanity. He might just be like, well, and before civilization, there was matriarchy.
But judging on the rest of Kalergi's work, I highly doubt that that's what it is. I think this is one of the. I bet you any money, this is one of the most damning critiques of matriarchy and female emancipation that's ever been written, and has been vaulted for a reason. In Switzerland,
we could destroy his reputation
among
the globalists
it might destroy the reputation of what the EU is preaching currently. I think it might be a damning thing to actually put out, and would probably ruin what they have now created as the legacy ideology of what Kalergi actually was.
Or it might be really woke and
also
would actually become super popular if it were published in English.
True. So maybe we should have a project on that.
Yeah.
Getting our hands on that would be a very interesting thing. So what other questions we got?
All right,
I think
that's it. One last question.
All right.
Was Kalergi a Shaboskoy, or was he an important ideologue and political actor?
That's a hard one. I hate to say that's a hard one, because obviously he married a Jewess and all the other fun stuff.
Yeah, was he just a mouthpiece, or was he what?
I think he originally wasn't, but he became one, like post hoc kind of thing.
You mean circa 1950?
Yeah, I think that after he kind of ran his course, and the people and like the powers that be, right, that became big issues. I think that I feel like honestly, maybe his idealism turned him into a Shaboskoy, unintentionally. Like he played into their hands without intending to do so. Might have been the bigger deal there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it seems like he sort of like a surfer. He saw the wave coming. He got on the board correctly. Hitler just got on his board and was like, "All right, I'm gonna go over that wave.
Yeah.
Woo! Watch this.
Yeah. Hold my beer."
Kalergi's like, "All right, I'm gonna start paddling away real fast."
Yeah,
and then the wave came and he went way up, and
it took him into the reef.
Well, he mostly rode it down pretty well, but and he just crashed into the reef.
But that's the thing, he didn't have a really cool wipeout like Hitler did, Like Hitler rode the peak of the wave and then wiped out, right? And then Kalergi was like, "Oh, I'll just ride the wave until it's nothing anymore." And then it just kind of like he
fell off and face planted in the wet sand on the beach, and then just drowned.
Yeah, it was like, cool ride, bro, but it wasn't really a cool ending, right? Like Hitler was like, he had the surfer music playing in the background or whatever, and there was a massive wipeout, right? Like he rode it to the peak, massive wipeout, the barrel and everything. It was a gorgeous run, right? And then on top of that, people hail him because his wipeout was so cool, right? As compared to Kalergi's filtering out at the end there.
Yeah,
not to use super colloquial
I guess
stuff.
the main thing on Kalergi, that my main takeaway is that he comparing him to Hitler, Kalergi is 95% right about everything.
Yeah.
He just comes to some wrong conclusions in a spectacularly evil way.
Right. Or that could be utilized in a spectacularly evil way.
Right, that then give us the political and ideological situation we have in Europe today, which is, we don't
even have to elaborate on that.
Utterly absurd. I mean, forget about immigration and all that, and race mixing and all that.
The
insanity.
politics itself.
Even just the notion that Germany and France can be independent actors.
Yeah,
it's like I'm not against that, of course. Well, I'm not against Germany and France being, real countries. But like if we're just looking at how things actually are,
right,
it is nothing like what Kalergi wanted.
No, not at all.
And it's not a federation in any sense. I think the best comparison of Europe to America now is like Rome to the Italian city-states in the second century BC, say, where you've got like a clearly dominant power and then either half rights or pseudo rights for the allied half Latin cities or allied cities. And
it's a total puppet state.
It's gonna. I don't know if Kalergi foresaw this. I don't know if Spengler did, but I think what's going to happen with Europe is that there's going to have to be sort of basically the same thing that happened with Rome and the Italian allies, where there's going to be a fight of some kind where the Italian allies are like, we want to be Roman citizens too, and Rome is going to be like, no, you can't be Roman citizens. But then there's going to be a fight, and Rome's going to win the fight militarily or politically, but in the end, like the Italian allies are going to get what they want, and they're going to get citizenship, and then it's all going to be incorporated into one.
Yeah, one way or the other, Europe has got to become sovereign on its own. There's no way for Europe to survive in any way, shape, or form with the control mechanisms that are placed on either side of it.
I was suggesting that Europe and the United States are just got to unite.
Well, God, that's a. Yeah, that'd be kind of a cool idea, but then that gets into 1984 with the concept of the Atlantic Alliance that Orwell was talking about,
Well, okay, but that was a stupid fiction book. Like, I'm talking reality here. I think the best outcome for Europe and America is we need American political power and military power, and we need European cultural power, and yeah, like you can't have America without Europe is absurd,
right?
And you need both, and we need a way to like kind of bring the two together. Actually, that would be my main criticism of Kalergi, is the whole idea of having an independent Europe. It's like having an independent. It would be like saying, "Oh, let's have the Greek empires of the Hellenistic era be independent for another like 500 years after Alexander." It's like, yeah, maybe a little while, but eventually they're going to have to be incorporated into the whole civilization, which is, Rome and Greece. Same thing with us. And
I feel like it could have happened. Like back in the day, Europe would have been the center of it.
Well, if Germany had won the war,
right,
or both wars, then yes, Germany would be the leading political power.
And Europe
I would be talking about we need to subordinate America to
right.
Germany.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like in a way what I want.
Right.
It's like, don't call me an America shell here. Like,
yeah, right.
I think both of us agree.
Yeah,
it's
that's not happening. No,
Hitler should have won the war.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're all on that page.
That would have been better.
Right.
But because he didn't, we have this absurd and bad
totally different situation
now where America has all the political and military power. For Europe and European culture to survive, it needs to be incorporated into America in a non-gay and non-retarded way.
And that's the big question of the century, is how to make it not gay and not retarded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely discuss that later because I have a lot of thoughts on that. I'm sure you do too.
Oh, yeah.
Hope you've enjoyed this discussion of Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in the subject, to get this book by Martin Bond, Hitler's Cosmopolitan Bastard. It's a very good read, very well done, very well researched, very even. By far the best treatment of the subject that can be had.
Phenomenal.